Good morning, everybody. First topic for today is fluid and electrolyte balance. Now we'll be covering this topic under the headings Introduction, the body fluid compartments, fluid homeostasis, the indications of IV fluid therapy, and the IV fluids and their properties of some of the important ones, and the principles and protocols of IV fluid and electrolyte therapy and fluid therapy in surgical patients. Now, many inpatients need IV fluids. Why? To prevent or correct problems and to fluid and electrolyte status correction. Now, as they cannot meet their normal needs by oral or enteral routes, why? Because they have unusual fluid and or electrolyte deficit, or they might not be in a position to have food, water after a surgery or before a surgery. Now, despite the relative complexity of estimating a patient's IV needs, this task is prescribed to the most junior medical staff, usually the nursing staff or the interns. And these people usually lack the relative experience. So there is a clear need for guidance on IV fluid therapy, which involves both the prescription and monitoring. Now, what are the fluid compartments? Now, in a female, the solid component of the body is 45%, whereas it is 40% in male. Now, fluids make up 55% of the body mass in females and 60% of the body mass in males. Now, out of the 60% of fluid, 2/3 is intracellular fluid and 1/3 is extracellular fluid. Among that, 80% is your interstitial fluid and 20% is the plasma. So the total body water is intracellular, extracellular fluid, in which there is interstitial and intravascular fluid. Now the total body percentage is 60%. For a 70 kg adult, it is 42 liters is made up of water. In that, intracellular fluid is 40%, that is 28 liters, and extracellular fluid is 20%, that is 14 liters. Now, in extracellular fluid, interstitial is 15% and plasma is 5%. Here again, it is showing the extracellular fluid, and inside the box is your intracellular fluid. The sodium of extracellular fluid is 145 milliequivalents per liter, whereas in intracellular fluid it is 12. The potassium is 4 extracellular and 140 intracellular. Calcium is 2.5 extra and 4 in intracellular compartments. Now, these are the three main things that might be asked for you in your MCQs: sodium, potassium, and calcium. Now, what are the indications of IV fluid therapy? When the patient cannot take oral intake, like maybe the patient is in comatose state or patient is in surgery, or if the patient has severe vomiting or diarrhea, because in that case we need to give a bowel rest, or if the patient has dehydration and shock, if the patient has hypovolemia due to any cause, we need to rapidly correct the volume loss, or if the patient is hypoglycemia, which can lead to a comatose state, we need to rapidly correct the fluid as well as the glucose levels. IV fluids are also used as a vehicle for IV medications, or if the patient requires total parenteral nutrition, and in certain critical conditions like anaphylaxis, severe asthma, or cardiac arrest. These are your indications for IV fluid therapy. What are the advantages? It is accurate, it can be controlled, and the outcome is predictable. The response is immediate, and along with the fluids, the electrolyte disturbances also can be corrected. So the advantage is it is accurate, controlled, and predictable outcome. The response is immediate, and the correction of fluid and electrolyte disturbances can be achieved. What are the disadvantages? It is expensive, and it requires a level of strict asepsis because we are introducing something directly into the body. If we are not careful, we might be introducing bacteria or virus into the body. Now, this is possible only in hospitalized patients. You cannot ask the patient to take IV fluid at home, and improper technique in itself leads to complications. What are the complications? The patient might develop a hematoma at the site. There can be infusion phlebitis, damaging the vein or artery. And if given over, it causes circulation overload. There might be air embolism that can be fatal. There may be infiltration into the surrounding soft tissue causing edema, or there may be an intra-arterial injection when it is not supposed to be given into the arterial route. Now, what is the daily water balance in health? Now, when we consume daily, water from beverages is 1200, water from solid food is around 1000 ml, and water from metabolic oxidation is 300 ml. Now, what is the output? Daily urine output is 1500 ml, and an ongoing process of insensible loss from skin and lungs, like when we perspire or when we sweat or when we breathe, is 900 ml, and in the feces is 100 ml. Now, the input. Under normal circumstances, most of our fluid intake is in the form of drink, but food also contains fluid and electrolytes, and water is an end product of its oxidation. And drinking is governed by thirst, which is triggered when the water balance is negative, either because of insufficient intake or because of increased loss. Now, what is the output? First of all, the insensible loss. Evaporation of water from the lungs and skin occurs all the time, and we are not even aware of it. The gastrointestinal loss. Normally, the intestines absorb water and electrolytes efficiently. So the fluid in the stool is as little as 100 to 150 ml per day. However, in the presence of diseases, this might be greatly increased. Kidneys are the main organs for fluid and electrolyte regulation, and they are concerned with the excretion of waste products, example, urea. Now, their activity is controlled by pressure and osmotic sensors, which result in changes in the secretion of hormones, which maintain your normal homeostasis. Now, what are the signs and symptoms of fluid deficit in a patient? A recent history of weight loss, dry eyes or mouth, and sunken eyes. The change in the mental status of the patient, or the patient might have fever, vomiting, or postural hypotension. Now, when you suddenly get up and the patient develops a sense of giddiness, postural hypotension can also be seen in fluid deficit. Or if there is a small amount of concentrated urine being excreted by the patient, or if the patient develops weakness, low blood pressures, convulsions, or loss of elasticity of the skin and a dry, warm skin. Now, pulse might be weak and there might be cramping in the arms and legs. Now, these are all the signs and symptoms of a fluid deficit. Now, what are the signs and symptoms of a fluid excess? There will be swelling or edema in the feet, ankle, wrist, and face. Patient might have headache, abdominal distension, a high blood pressure, or a shortness of breath, pulmonary edema, and pleural effusion. Now, all these occur when there is a fluid excess. Now, how do we classify IV fluids? Now, what are the fluids that we give? We give crystalloids, colloids, and some special fluids. Now, what are crystalloids? Crystalloids are solutions that contain small molecules that easily flow across the cell membrane. So, they are easily permeable. Now, this allows for transfer from the bloodstream into the cells and body tissues, that is the target organs. Now, this will increase fluid volume in both interstitial and intravascular spaces. So, crystalloids increase the volume in interstitial and intravascular spaces. Now, when you compare crystalloids versus colloids, now crystalloids, intravascular persistence is poor, whereas colloids, it is good. Hemodynamic stabilization, crystalloids is transient. It is only a brief period of time, whereas colloids achieve this for a long period. Now, the required infusion volume of crystalloids is large, whereas colloids is moderate. Now, the risk of edema is obvious in crystalloids, whereas it is insignificant in colloids. Anaphylaxis is next to nothing in crystalloids, and it is low in colloids. The plasma colloid oncotic pressure is reduced in crystalloids, and in colloids it is maintained. The cost, crystalloids are inexpensive and colloids are expensive. Now, what are your crystalloids? Normal saline, ringer lactate, that is the RL, 5% dextrose in water, DNS, your sodium bicarbonate, injection of KCl, or a 25% dextrose. Now, all these solutions are our crystalloids. These are inexpensive. Now, among them, the important one is your normal saline. The important point to remember here is the sodium concentration of normal saline is 154. Now, it is called normal saline because the percentage of sodium and chlorine is similar to the concentration present in the intravascular space. Now, and it is a useful solution to correct both the fluid and electrolyte deficit. Now, what are the indications when you should give normal saline? when the water and salt depletion is severe. Example, when the patient has vomiting, diarrhea, and excessive perspiration, or if the patient has hypovolemic shock, or if there is initial fluid therapy in diabetic ketoacidosis, or in pre-renal acute renal failure. Now, these are the cases where we give normal saline. Most important for you to remember is in cases of severe water and salt depletion like vomiting, diarrhea, excessive perspiration, and hypovolemic shock. Now, when should you not give normal saline? If the patient is hypertensive or pre-eclamptic patients. In also patients who have edema due to congestive heart failure, renal disease, and cirrhosis. These are the patients in which we do not give normal saline. Now, what is Ringer's lactate? Commonly called RL. It is the most physiological fluid because the electrolyte content of sodium, potassium, and calcium is almost similar to the composition of plasma. So even a large amount of Ringer's lactate can be infused rapidly without risking the electrolyte imbalance in the patient. So here you need to remember that 1 liter of Ringer's lactate contains sodium 130, chlorine 109, potassium 4, and calcium 3 milliequivalents per liter, and bicarbonate of 28. Now, when do you give Ringer's lactate? When we have to correct hypovolemia rapidly and as a replacement fluid in burns, post-operative patients, in patients with fractures or peritoneal irrigation. In this, you need to remember most importantly that the fluid of choice in a patient of burns is Ringer's lactate. Now, what is 5% dextrose in water? It is used to correct dehydration and it supplies energy because it contains dextrose. Now, after the glucose consumption, the remaining water in the solution is distributed in all compartments of the body proportionately. So, this is the best agent to correct intracellular dehydration. Now, it is used when there is need of water, but of not electrolytes. So, the indications are in pre and post-operative fluid replacement. So, because if the patient is being posted for surgery, he will be kept nil by mouth before the surgery and a few hours after the surgery. So to maintain the patient's glucose levels, we use 5% dextrose in water, or it can also be used as a medium for IV administration of various drugs. Now, what is contraindications for this fluid? If the patient has cerebral edema, or in case of neurosurgical procedures, because this increases the intracranial tension. Now, as we have discussed in the previous classes, intracranial tension is to be maintained at all times. Now, if the patient has acute ischemic stroke, if you give 5% dextrose, the hyperglycemia aggravates the ischemia, causing more brain damage. In hypovolemic shock, replacement by a large volume of 5% dextrose in water causes hyperglycemia and osmotic diuresis. Now, this causes increased urine output, further delaying the correction of dehydration. So, in a patient of hypovolemic shock, you should not give 5% dextrose because it delays the correction of dehydration. Now, what is DNS, your dextrose normal saline? It provides both energy and salt. The major extracellular electrolytes like sodium and chlorine are present in this. Now, what is the difference between this and your 5% dextrose that do not contain electrolytes? This contains sodium and chlorine, and it is also giving energy. DNS is chiefly distributed in extracellular fluid compartment. Unlike your 5% dextrose, it does not correct the intracellular dehydration. Now, I have told you that 5% dextrose corrects all components, whereas DNS is only for your extracellular component. Now, as the DNS increases only extracellular fluid volume, it can be considered as a treatment for hypovolemic shock. Like 5% dextrose, large volumes of DNS will lead to glucose load, leading to hyperglycemia, which induces your osmotic diuresis, reduced correction of dehydration. Now, what are the contraindications? If patient has anasarca, or if there is severe hypovolemic shock, where rapid replacement of large volumes is required. Rapid infusion causes hyperglycemia and osmotic diuresis. This is the important point for DNS. What is your sodium bicarbonate? It is available as a sodium bicarbonate injection of 7.5%, 25 ml ampule. Now, what does this contain? 22.5 milliequivalents of sodium and 22.5 milliequivalents of bicarbonate. It is used for acute barbiturate and salicylate poisoning along with diuretics. What are the special precautions to be taken? It should not be given as a bolus except in emergency cases. It is very irritant. Extravasation can lead to extensive tissue necrosis. So care should be taken when administering this. It has to be given slowly and it should not be mixed with an injection of calcium and sodium bicarbonate, because in the same syringe or same IV line, if you give, the combination causes calcium carbonates, white crystals. Injection potassium chloride. Each ampule of 10 ml contains 20 milliequivalents of potassium. It is chiefly intracellular in action, but its presence in extracellular fluid compartments is very important for your neuromuscular regulation. The action is intracellular, but its presence in the extracellular fluid is important for the neuromuscular regulation. Now, when do we give injection KCl? Basically to treat or prevent hypokalemia. The normal requirement of an adult is 60 milliequivalents. Now I have told you one ampule contains 20 milliequivalents. So based on that, we titrate the dose, and the improper usage can cause hyperkalemia, leading to sudden death and cardiac arrests. What are the basic rules when you administer injection KCl? Never give it direct IV. Always use diluted form. Never give more than 40 milliequivalents. The patient might require 60, but you should not directly give at a single time more than 40. And never infuse more than 10 milliequivalents per hour. So if you are giving 40 milliequivalents, it should be given slow IV over a period of 4 hours. And the serum potassium levels and ECG monitoring of the patient should be done. Now, what is injection 25% dextrose? It comes in a 100 ml bottle and it contains 25 grams of glucose. When do we use it? When we need energy and prevention of catabolism. It is a concentrated form. It contains 25 grams. So it is useful as a fast replacement of glucose in patients who are having hypoglycemic coma. And it provides large glucose in small volumes. What are the indications? Rapid correction and to provide nutrition to patient on a maintenance fluid therapy. What is your Darrow solution? It is a mixture of all these three, that is potassium chloride, sodium chloride and sodium lactate. When do we use it? As a replacement fluid therapy in potassium deficit. What does Darrow solution contain? Potassium chloride, sodium chloride and sodium lactate. What are some of the special fluids? Isolite G, isolite M, isolite P used in children and isolite E. What is isolite G? Now, it is the gastric replacement solution. That is why it is called isolite G. It provides all the electrolytes lost by gastric juice. Once again, that's why isolite G. It corrects the electrolytes and provides your calories. When do we use isolite M? It is a maintenance fluid. That is why it is called isolite M. The proportion of electrolytes in this is almost similar to the maintenance required by the body. So it fulfills the need of electrolytes, pH maintenance, calorie supply and water replacement. Now this is the richest source of potassium. So useful to treat hypokalemia. What is isolite P? This was designed to meet the maintenance fluid requirements of children. Now as compared to adults, children need less electrolytes and more water. So isolite P provides double the water but same electrolytes as isolite M. So once again, isolite P has half the concentration of electrolytes compared to isolite M, giving double the water. What is isolite E? It is your extracellular replacement solution. It has electrolytes similar to the extracellular fluid, except it has double the concentration of potassium and acetate. Now, this is the only fluid available to correct your magnesium deficiency. So, the fluid of choice in a patient with magnesium deficiency is isolite E, useful for extracellular solution replacement. Now, what are colloids? These are solutions that contain large molecules that do not cross the cell membrane. Crystalloids have small molecules, colloids have large molecules. Now, when these are infused, they remain in the intravascular compartment because they cannot cross the cell membrane. So this causes expansion of the intravascular space and volume. Now they draw fluid from the extravascular space due to their high oncotic pressures. So these stay in the intravascular compartment and also bring fluid from the extravascular compartments inside. Now what are the colloids? Your albumin, dextran, hydroxyethyl starch or HES, hetastarch, or pentastarch. What is albumin? It is a physiological plasma protein. The main function is to maintain plasma oncotic pressure. Other functions like binding and transport of low molecular weight substances like bilirubin, hormones, and drugs. Now, 5% albumin has a colloid oncotic pressure of 20 millimeters of mercury. This is similar to plasma. This expands plasma volume when infused. So, albumin is used as a plasma expander. 25% albumin has an oncotic pressure of 70 millimeters of mercury, and it expands the plasma volume by 4 to 5 times the volume that is infused. So if you give 5% albumin, it increases the plasma volume as the same amount that is given, whereas 25% albumin increases the volume 4 to 5 times the volume that is given. Now the plasma volume occurs at the expense of interstitial fluid volume. That is, the fluid shifts from extravascular to intravascular compartment. So albumin should not be used when the patient has hypovolemia. You will be exacerbating the condition. It is preferred in patients with hypoproteinemia and anasarca. The infusion of albumin causes shifting of fluid from interstitial space to the vascular space. Now, what are the indications when there is need for plasma volume expansion? To correct your hypoproteinemia in anasarca, and it is used as an exchange fluid in therapeutic plasmapheresis. Now, what are the precautions to be taken when giving albumin? If you give it too fast, it causes circulatory overload and pulmonary edema. It is contraindicated in severe anemia and in patients on cardiac failure. What is your dextran? Glucose polymers that are produced by bacteria incubated in a sucrose medium. So it is produced by bacteria that are present in a sucrose medium. There are two forms, dextran 70 with a molecular weight of 70,000 and dextran 40 with a molecular weight of 40,000. So dextran 70, dextran 40. Now both these are effectively expand intravascular volume. This is not a substitute for whole blood because it does not have oxygen carrying capacity. So when do we use this? So you're doing a surgery, there is unexpected blood loss and the replacement blood takes time. So we can use this as an emergency substitute to expand the intravascular volume, but the defect is it cannot carry oxygen. It minimizes sludging of the blood, preventing intravascular aggregation of RBC and improves the microcirculation. What are the indications to correct hypovolemia? DVT prophylaxis and post-operative and post-traumatic thromboembolism, and it improves the blood flow and microcirculation when there is threatened vascular gangrene. Now, what are the side effects? It can cause your renal failure. There might be a hypersensitivity reaction to the dextran itself, or it might interfere with our blood grouping and cross-matching results. What is your hetastarch? That is HES, hydroxyethyl starch. It is a synthetic colloid available as 6% solution in isotonic saline. It is composed of more than 90% esterified amylopectin. This esterification retards the degradation, which leads to longer plasma expansion. So if you need plasma expansion for a long period of time, the fluid used is hetastarch. Now, after you give hetastarch, molecules with low molecular weight are excreted in the urine in the 24-hour duration. Large molecules are eliminated slowly. Now, high colloidal oncotic pressure, that is more than 5% albumin, causes greater plasma volume expansion. Now, the increased serum amylase concentration during and 3 to 5 days after the discontinuation of hetastarch is seen. So, you have given a patient hetastarch, the serum concentration of amylase is elevated for up to 5 days. So, if the patient has acute pancreatitis, you cannot use serum amylase concentration as a blood investigation that is reliable. What is pentastarch? It is a low molecular weight derivative of hetastarch. It differs by having low degree of esterification. Because it contains smaller and more starch molecules, it has a higher colloid oncotic pressure. Now, what are the principles of intravenous fluid therapy? Now, intravenous fluid therapy is provided only for patients who cannot meet their needs by oral or enteral routes, and it is given only by skilled, competent healthcare professionals, and there should be assessing and monitoring of the patient who are receiving the IV fluids. Now, when you give IV fluids, remember the 5 R's, that is resuscitation, route maintenance, replacement, redistribution, and reassessment. What are the 5 R's? We resuscitate, we maintain the route, we replace what is lost, there is redistribution, and again reassessment. IV fluid prescription. The type of fluid to be administered should be there, and the rate and volume at which the fluid to be given should also be written there. Now, what is the IV fluid management plan? It should be the fluid and electrolyte prescription for the next 24 hours. That means the person administering this should be aware of the requirement of the patient for the next 24 hours. Now, by this, we need to assess and monitor the plan. We need to titrate the dosage accordingly. Now, when prescribing IV fluids and electrolytes, we need to take into account the other sources of the patient's intake, any oral or enteral intake or IV nutrition or any blood or blood products that we might be giving. If a patient needs IV fluids, we need to explain this to the patient. We need to discuss the signs and symptoms that they need to be looking for in their body. Now, what is the initial assessment? Assess whether the patient is hypovolemic. The indicators that the patient may need urgent resuscitation are if the systolic blood pressure is less than 100 millimeters of mercury, if the heart rate is more than 90 beats per minute, if the capillary refill time is greater than 2 seconds, or if the peripheries are cold to touch, or if the patient's breathing rate is more than 20 breaths per minute. So the systolic BP should be less than 100, heart rate is more than 90, capillary refill time is more than 2 seconds, the peripheries are cold, and the patient's respiratory rate is more than 20. If any of these are present, that is when you need to know that the patient requires urgent fluid resuscitation. Now, we need to assess the patient's likely fluid and electrolyte needs from the history, clinical examination, monitoring, and laboratory investigations. Now, history, any previous limited intake, and what is the quantity and composition of any abnormal loss or any comorbidities that the patient might be having, like your hypertension, diabetes. In clinical examination, we need to assess the patient's fluid status by pulse, BP, capillary refill, and jugular venous pressure. We also need to look for the presence of pulmonary or peripheral edema. This will get to know if there is overload. Or we need to know the presence of postural hypotension. That is, there is less volume. What is the clinical monitoring entail? We need to check for the fluid balance charts and the weight of the patient. What are the laboratory investigations done? That is a full blood count, urea, creatinine to know the functioning of the kidneys and the electrolyte levels. How do you reassess? If the patient receives IV fluids for resuscitation, we reassess the patient by using the ABCDE approach. That is, we check for the airway, breathing, circulation, disability, and exposure. We monitor their respiratory rate, pulse, BP, and perfusion continuously. Now, all the patients who receive IV fluids need continuous regular monitoring. Now, if the patient needs IV fluid for routine maintenance, how much should you restrict your prescription to? That is 25 to 30 ml per kg per hour of water. That entails approximately 1 millimole per kg per day of potassium, sodium, and chlorine, and 50 to 100 grams per day of glucose to limit the starvation ketosis. So the fluid level is 25 to 30 ml per kg per hour, and the potassium, sodium, and chlorine levels are 1 millimoles per kg per day. Now, for the patients who are obese, we might need to adjust the prescription based on their ideal body weight. We need to prescribe lesser amounts for them, that is 20 to 25 ml. And also in patients who are old, who have renal impairment, cardiac failure, who are malnourished, we need to consider delivering IV fluids during daytime hours. Now, what is replacement and redistribution? We need to adjust the IV prescription according to the existing fluid and electrolyte deficit or according to the ongoing loss. We need to seek expert help if the patient has gross edema, sepsis, hyponatremia or hypernatremia, because the sodium levels need to be monitored, renal, liver or cardiac impairment, post-operative fluid retention and redistribution. In surgical patients, multiple factors modify the normal physiology of fluid and electrolyte balance. Therefore, there is a special consideration. What are the important factors to be considered? Any surgical case is an acute stress. There is physical and mental stress which occurs during surgery, leading to increased sympathetic stimuli, which causes increased heart rate, vasoconstriction, and stress again. In these patients, there is increased secretion of ACTH. This in turn stimulates your adrenal glands. Now, these stimulated adrenal glands secrete hydrocortisone to fight the stress, aldosterone, which leads to sodium retention, and urinary loss of potassium. During major surgery, hypovolemia also occurs, and this leads to increased aldosterone secretion. Now, this occurs for the first 2 to 3 days after surgery, decreasing the sodium requirement. So, we need to monitor the amount of sodium that is present in the fluid that we are giving the patient. Postoperative pain and stress again leads to increased ADH secretion from posterior pituitary in the first 2 to 3 days after surgery. Now, this causes increased water retention, leading to reduced urine output on the first postoperative day. So, we need to remember that the maintenance fluid required on the first post-op day is less, even though the patient urine output might be less. Now, in surgical patients, we need to correct hypovolemia, anemia, and electrolyte disturbances. How do you correct hypovolemia? Hypovolemia jeopardizes O2 transport, causing tissue hypoxia. If it is uncorrected, there is increased vascular resistance and heart rate due to the normal baroreceptor reflex preoperatively. But after giving anesthesia, the reflexes are lost. So the compensation mechanism by the baroreceptor is lost. The patient then develops severe hypotension or even acute renal failure. Now, if it is not corrected preoperatively, hypotension is to be anticipated intra and postoperatively. So the preoperative fluid correction is of utmost importance. How do you correct anemia? To establish hemodynamic stability with patients of blood loss, for proper tissue oxygenation, to cope up with the possible anticipated blood loss, and for proper post-op recovery and wound healing. Now, once again, this is an important point for you. What is the crystalloid versus colloid debate? Crystalloids are most commonly used because they are less expensive, they are easily available, and they are reaction free. But since it passes through the semi-permeable membrane, it cannot be confined to the intravascular compartment alone. They have a short-lived hemodynamic improvement effect. Their action is only for a limited time. Large volumes are required for the correction of hypotension. Now, this large volume causes excess salt and water retention, leading to edema. Now, colloids are used when there is rapid restoration of plasma needed to correct acute hypotension, either due to major blood loss. Now, these do not cause the semi-permeable membranes and remain in the intravascular compartment. So, these are more effective than crystalloids in treating hypotension. Once again, colloids increase the plasma volume for a long period of time compared to crystalloids. So, smaller volumes improve the hemodynamic status, but the drawback is these are expensive and there is a risk of hypersensitivity. What are your goals of therapy? BP to be maintained greater than 100/70 millimeters of mercury, pulse rate to be less than 120, hourly urine output to be 30 to 50 ml per hour, and the normal temperature and respiration to be maintained. How long to give the fluids? Short operative procedure, and patients who do not have handling of tissue or viscera will only require maintenance fluid to correct the deficit due to the nil by mouth state. After 4 to 5 hours, we restart the fluids and IV is not required. Now, in patients with large surgeries, which there is intestinal resection, anastomosis, colectomy, the patient will be having a nil by mouth for a long duration of time. Oral intake is not instituted immediately. These are the people who require your IV therapy. Now, prolonged vomiting or nasogastric suction, the fluid of choice is normal saline. In patients of prolonged vomiting and nasogastric suction, there is normal saline is the fluid of choice. In cases of diarrhea or burns, Ringer lactate is the fluid of choice. If there is loss of blood, it is isotonic saline or Ringer's lactate. And if the blood loss is greater, we need to replace it with blood. In patients of hypoglycemia or hypoglycemic coma, 25% dextrose is the fluid of choice. If plasma volume expansion is needed, colloids are used. Now we'll go to the second topic. Second topic. One more important topic for you is your preoperative preparation. What is the definition? Preoperative preparation is the preparation of a patient who is requiring surgery to optimize the post-operative outcome. Now, it begins from the time of contact of the patient with the surgeon and only ends on the day of surgery in the preoperative room. This approach is multidisciplinary. It involves the participation of the anesthesia and surgical teams in conjunction with our radiologists, pathologists, specialist nursing staff, and also the operating room staff. Now, what are the objectives? Surgical, medical, and anesthetic aspect needs to be assessed. How to optimize the patient condition, how to take consent, and how to organize your operating theater list. Now, because you are going to be the interns of this college, you need to know all of these. Introduction. The preoperative assessment clinic is essential to gather all the information about the patient, to optimize the comorbidities, and to organize the anesthetic, surgical, and post-operative care before the surgery actually takes place. We need to be ready even before the surgery begins. Now, patients with severe comorbidities should be referred to the relevant specialist. Why? We need to quantify the risk and to take appropriate measures to minimize the morbidity. Now, surgery cannot be made completely risk-free, but we should anticipate the risks so that the patient can be informed to make an informed decision. Patients should be given advice on when they should be nil by mouth and what to do about their regular medications and pre-medications. Now, a plan for the operating list should be drawn up and all those who are involved in it should be informed beforehand. Now, what is your preoperative plan? We need to plan for the best patient outcome by gathering and recording all the relevant information. We need to optimize the patient's condition, and we need to choose the surgery with the most minimal risk and the maximum benefit. And we need to inform everyone concerned beforehand. Now, how do you assess the patient? History taking. A standard history needs to be taken. A set of fixed questions need to be determined the fitness for surgery. Like you can ask the patient if they'll be able to climb a flight of stairs without breathlessness. That will give you the cardio and respiratory status of the patient. Now, surgery specific symptoms need to be asked like onset, duration, what are the exacerbating and relieving factors. Now, your cardiovascular history, whether the patient has high BP, chest pain, syncope, dyspnea, and their exercise tolerance levels. Respiratory history includes history of smoking, productive cough, if the patient has wheeze, dyspnea, hoarseness of voice, or stridor. Increasing severity of the symptoms obviously indicates a worsening condition. Now, the past history of a surgery and anesthesia might reveal the problems that we might encounter in the present surgery. Any use of recreational drugs and alcohol needs to be noted down. Now, what are the principles of history taking? You need to listen to what is the problem by asking open questions, clarify about what the patient expects by asking closed questions, narrow down to a differential diagnosis by focused questioning, And we need to assess the fitness based on the comorbidities by asking fixed questions. Now, your medical examination general is whether the patient has anemia, jaundice, cyanosis, the nutritional status, and the sources of infection needs to be examined, like your teeth, feet, leg ulcers. In the cardiovascular, we assess for the pulse, blood pressure, heart sounds, bruise, and your peripheral edema. In the respiratory, we check for the respiratory rate and the effort. The chest expansion and percussion are noted. Breath sounds are heard, and oxygen saturation is checked for. In the GIT, we check for any abdominal masses, ascites, the bowel sounds, any hernias, and genitalia should be completely examined. Neurological examination is done to check for the conscious level of the patient, the cognitive function, the sensations, the muscle power, tone, and reflexes. And airway assessment needs to be done. Now, even though you might be taking the patient for a spinal surgery based on spinal anesthesia, airway assessment always needs to be done. How do you examine? We check for the positive findings, even if it is not related to the procedure being performed. Now, surgery related are the type and site of surgery, complications which have occurred due to the underlying pathology, any comorbidities and their severities like hypertension, diabetes, hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism. And for example, we need to also check for the patient is having any spinal abnormalities, because when we are positioning the patient, if the patient has kyphosis or scoliosis, we might encounter problems during the surgery or when giving spinal anesthesia. Now, the clinical findings, site, specific imaging or investigations required should be noted down. Sources of any potential bacteremia that can compromise the surgery, especially when we are using artificial materials, need to be checked for. Like when you're doing a knee replacement or a hip replacement, this potential bacteremia can compromise the surgery. We need to check for and treat infections in the preoperative period. What are those? Like your pressure sores, teeth and urine infections, infected toes. We need to screen the patient for methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus presence or not. Now, what are the investigations to be done? We ask for a full blood count, serum creatinine, ECG, chest radiography, urine analysis, blood glucose and HbA1c for long-term control of the sugar, and other specific investigations like LFT. Now, what is the preoperative management system of systemic diseases? We need to assess the baseline organ function. Optimization is by medication, lifestyle changes, like you can ask the patient to exercise a little, reduce weight if possible, cessation of smoking or alcohol, and specialist referral to improve a organ's capacity. We need to check for minimally impacting procedure that gives maximum benefit and appropriate post-operative care that improves the outcome. Now, theater preparation includes the timing, which case to be taken up when, the teamwork and special instruments required, and the equipment required. Now, risk assessment and consent. What are the risks related to the comorbidities, risk related to anesthesia, and risk related to the surgery itself? We need to explain the advantages, side effects, and prognosis to the patient in the language that they understand. And the consent should be valid, is necessary in all surgeries. The patient should give you an informed consent, except in cases of life-saving circumstances when the patient is unconscious, the patient does not have attenders with him. So the doctor should act in the best interest of the patient. So a valid consent implies that it is given voluntarily by a competent and informed person who is not under duress. In case of children, it is taken up by their parents. In emergency situation or in an unconscious patient, consent may not be obtained and the procedure is carried out in the best interest of the patient. Now, the operative team consists of the ward, theater and specialist nursing staff, anesthetic and surgical teams, radiology and pathology involvement is there for investigations, rehabilitation and social care workers, and specific personnel in individual cases. Now, how do you arrange the theater list? The date, place, and time of operation should be matched with the availability of personnel. Appropriate equipment and instruments should be made available beforehand. The operating list should be distributed as early as possible to all the staff so that the smooth functioning can be achieved. And you need to prioritize the patients. How? Children and diabetics are operated at the beginning of the list because they can't be kept nil by mouth for a long period of time. life and limb threatening surgery takes priority, and cancer patients need to be treated early compared to your elective surgical cases. Now, what are the special considerations? Now, the patients are advised not to take solids within 6 hours of the surgery and clear fluids within 2 hours before anesthesia to reduce the risk of acid aspiration syndrome. Now, in case of infants, you cannot keep them for 6 hours NBM. So, we allow clear drinks up to 2 hours, mother's milk up to 3 hours, and cow or formula milk up to 6 hours before anesthesia. Patients can continue to take their specified routine medication with sips of water, even though they are in the nil by mouth period. For example, if the patient is hypothyroid and on L-Troxin, you need to tell the patient that by taking sips of water, they should take the medication on the day of surgery. If they're hypertensive, that drug needs to be taken on the day of surgery. Now we need to continue the medications over the perioperative period, like as I told you, for drugs of hypertension, ischemic heart disease, or bronchodilators. Now, the patients on oral steroid therapy can be converted to your IV hydrocortisone. Oral warfarin should be stopped 3 to 4 days prior to surgery, and the prothrombin time should be checked to avoid any bleeding risks in the surgery. If the prothrombin time remains unacceptably high and the patient requires surgery, we can give an infusion of FFP, that is fresh frozen plasma. Now, those on warfarin who have had a life-threatening thrombotic episode, that is a pulmonary embolism, within the previous 3 months, you should not directly stop it. You should convert the treatment to IV heparin up to 6 hours before surgery, and heparin can be recommended 4 hours after the surgery again. So, if the patient is on oral warfarin, we need to convert it into heparin 6 hours before surgery, and again starting it after 4 hours after the surgery. Now, conclusion of the topic: the anticipated outcome of preoperative preparation in a patient who is informed about the surgical course and who can cope with it successfully. The goal is to decrease the complications and promote recovery. Now, when the patient is adequately prepared, both psychologically and physically, and the policies and guidelines have been followed, the risk of postoperative complications is usually low, leading to a faster recovery. Thank you.